This is Kyle Kondik. He is here to speak with us from Sabado's Crystal Ball University of Virginia Center for Politics. And this is the second time I'm doing this today, but this is our first time meeting. We kind of meet here live on air. Kyle, it's a pleasure to have you here. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, and we're going to dig into the Supreme Court ruling from yesterday. The Supreme Court, a 6-3 ruling, found that a Louisiana district relied too heavily on race in the drawing of its maps. Justice Samuel Alito calling this a, quote, unconstitutional gerrymander in their decision. Now, most filing deadlines for this year's congressional races have passed, but it remains to be seen the impact this has on the midterms. And we're specifically talking about what this does to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is landmark legislation that has been in place for more than 60 years and has for a long time protected minority communities against racially discriminatory election practices. And now it has come under question after this ruling by the Supreme Court. I want to start here, Kyle. Why does this ruling in particular impact Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act? And how does it impact that section?
Yeah, so the sort of legal realities or sort of the legal understanding of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is it's been fairly complicated over the years, but basically Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was understood to both protect the existence of and promote the creation of districts in which a certain minority group basically had the power to elect a candidate of their choice. And so the classic example of this, and you can find examples of these kinds of districts in Virginia and elsewhere in the South, it would be districts that are majority or plurality Black by composition. Generally, those districts would be electing, Democrats to the House. Back in the 90s, when you saw the explosion of these kinds of districts, it was actually Republicans in the George H.W. Bush controlled Justice Department who were pushing for the creation of these seats back when there were a bunch of conservative white Southern Democrats from the South. And so the idea was that if you kind of created more Black majority districts, you would weaken those white conservative Democrats who would then lose to Republicans, which is actually what ended up happening. Now, it's more complicated than that. But you got to the point where in many parts of the South, not Virginia, of course, because Virginia has a lot of other Democratic House members who come from, don't have to come from Black majority districts. But in states like Alabama and Louisiana and South Carolina and Tennessee, the only Democrats in those states come from, significantly Black districts that, exist as sort of these blue islands amongst a sea of red. And the upshot of this decision is likely going to be that those districts aren't protected anymore. And so what we're immediately seeing is that decision applied to Louisiana. Louisiana is moving as we speak to push back its U.S. House primary, which was supposed to take place later in May, and to redraw to eliminate at least one and possibly two Black Democratic districts from that state. And you might see Tennessee do it yet this year. You might see South Carolina try to do it this year. And then into 2028, you're probably going to see more states do it. And there are ripple effects beyond that, because in blue states, there are districts that were seen to be, protected by Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act or mandated by Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act that aren't going to be that way now. And so that might actually help Democrats have more effective partisan gerrymanders in some of the states that they control. And we're already seeing all this in the midst of this big redistricting fight across the country where both Republicans and Democrats trying to maximize their advantage. Of course, we saw that in Virginia with this ongoing redistricting saga. Voters approved a new Democratic gerrymander recently. It's possible that the Supreme Court of Virginia will rule against the process that led to the adoption of that map. So lots and lots of moving pieces here.
We talk about all those moving pieces, and then it kind of, for me, a lot of times it goes back to this sort of foundational thing where if this has been around since 1965, and in many, many instances of public rhetoric is widely celebrated as groundbreaking landmark legislation, how unprecedented is it? How surprising is it even for an act like this, a piece of legislation like this, to now experience such radical change? I mean, more than 60 years, and in many instances celebrated. Why is this happening now?
Well, look, you've got a pretty conservative court who interprets things differently than than courts in the past would have interpreted. And interestingly, as recently as 2023, there was a ruling, Allen v. Milligan, that effectively, forced the adoption of a second black district that elected a Democrat in Louisiana, and also that had a ripple, or that ruling initially applied to Alabama, but then also effectively applied to Louisiana. And so as recently as the 2024 cycle, Democrats got an extra seat apiece out of Alabama and Louisiana because the U.S. Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision said that those districts, again, I'm oversimplifying, but basically that they needed to be created. And then just a few years later, you have the court issuing a much more sweeping ruling saying, well, actually, those districts don't have to be created. And in fact, some of these districts that were created decades ago probably can be unwound. I say probably because I think there is a little bit of gray area in this ruling, but it seems like some of the um, it may basically be that and this is what Justice Elena Kagan, one of the liberal justices, said in her dissent, that it basically renders Section 2 a dead letter, but it doesn't actually like overturn it in totality, and so you may still see claims made under Section 2 in various instances, but our understanding of it has been changed. At the very least, it's been very much curtailed from our understanding of it prior to the Calley decision coming out earlier this week.
And in terms of the midterms, what kind of actual tangible impact do you see this having on this particular election cycle?
So far this year, if you include Virginia and Florida, which just redrew, and again, I mentioned that there are still legal questions about Virginia. There's going to be a court fight in Florida over their new map, which is a pro-Republican map. So you've had 8 states redistrict. That includes the 3 biggest states in the country: California, Texas, and Florida. Big, decent-sized states like Virginia, Ohio, and North Carolina, Utah, and Missouri as well. Those 8 states together account for almost 40% of all the House districts in the country. So we're really talking about a lot of action in redistricting so far. The net change from all of these new maps, some in favor of Democrats, some ordered by courts, some in favor of Republicans, really hasn't changed the overall House map that much. And I think when Donald Trump initially went to Texas and said, "Hey, draw me a new pro-Republican map," I think the hope from the White House was that they would get a durable, a more Republican-leaning national House map through all these efforts. That has not happened yet. I guess it may still, depending on how everything shakes out. But what we're going to see again is Louisiana probably is going to draw at least one new Republican seat, and maybe 2. Again, maybe at Tennessee or South Carolina. Maybe there are other states that we don't expect who eventually gets involved here. But this decision has come fairly late in the electoral calendar, in that, like, Mississippi is a state that naturally you'd think could maybe eliminate the one Democratic seat that it has. Mississippi had its primary almost 2 months ago at this point. So you would think that it's just too late, but again, it's going to have ripple effects down the line. And in the future, it could have an impact on Virginia too, because Virginia is the kind of state where you would have these kinds of like VRA districts, either at like Bobby Scott's congressional district is a good example of the kinds of these kinds of districts. And you have some in the state legislature as well. That may change how maps are drawn, after the next census, or if there was another mid-decade redistricting effort in Virginia, as we just saw here in 2025 and 2026.
And, when we talk about how in 2023 there was a case that was very, very similar regarding this particular section, this piece of legislation. So we know that these can come about at any point in time. But is this a direct result of Donald Trump going and saying, "I need Texas Republicans to find me 5 more seats"? That is the spark, and that domino has ultimately landed here in the Supreme Court. Can you draw a direct through line between those two things?
I wouldn't connect the two directly, because this court, it's not a surprise that this particular Supreme Court, with this kind of, basically very conservative leaning court, would issue this ruling, and it's not directly related to the president's push for more seats. Now, if you wanted to be cynical about it, you could say, hey, the U.S. Supreme Court is doing the bidding of Donald Trump by issuing a ruling that is in the short term could lead to more Republican House seats. I don't necessarily think that that was a fair attack. Maybe others would disagree with that. But and again, it's coming late enough in the cycle that it's probably going to have some bearing on 2026, but not as much bearing as it would have if it had come out this time last year or even in like November or December.
And then, I guess just straight up, every piece of reporting seems to point to this, or most seem to point to this, but I still want to ask you, is this going to lead to the disenfranchisement of minority voters in the United States?
So this is a complicated question. I think in the short term, there will be fewer black members of the U.S. House from the South. There will be and they will Democrats will be will bear the brunt of that. Um, does it affect anyone's ability to vote? No, I don't think it does. But gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering itself, you could argue, is disenfranchising because it generally reduces the number of competitive seats. But the thing is that partisan gerrymandering does happen all over the country, and in a certain sense, you could say that this isn't discriminating against black voters, it's discriminating against Democrats. It's allowing Republicans in Republican controlled states to discriminate against Democratic voters in their state in the same way that Democrats in their own controlled states will sometimes discriminate against Republican voters through partisan gerrymandering. And again, maybe the word discriminate is not the right word to use here. But from the Republican perspective, they look at it and say, if you can do partisan gerrymandering in other states, why can't you do it in the South too? And effectively, the U.S. Supreme Court said, yeah, you can do partisan gerrymandering in an even more aggressive way in the South, just like you can in the rest of the country. I mean, one of the big stories from the U.S. Supreme Court over the last several years is that, I mean, the U.S. Supreme Court has never outlawed partisan gerrymandering. It suggested at some points that it might do that, but it never actually has. And this court has continued to decline to intervene against partisan gerrymandering. And a result of this decision will just be more partisan gerrymandering and probably more aggressive forms of it. Maybe Congress could come together at some point and come up with some, neutral redistricting criteria. But the idea of the two parties coming to agreement on something as fundamentally partisan as gerrymandering to try to eliminate it just seems like really pie in the sky thinking.
And you talk about everything you've gone through here just now. We talk about how this moment could lead to more aggressive partisan gerrymandering. We talk about the disintegration of major tenets of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We discuss the fact that there's been a redistricting battle playing out on a national scale, state to state, over the past 6 months. And then we can go all the way back to the SAVE Act, which has created major conflict between Democrats and Republicans, and even President Donald Trump, who for a long time fought the results of the 2020 election, and at times will even continue to mention that election and question the results. What sort of precarious position are we in right now in terms of our democracy, representation, and voting as a representative form of government and of selection process? I mean, where do we stand right now? Because it feels incredibly shaky, fragile, and sort of less representative than maybe it has been in the past, just based on how much change and strife there is.
So a few points. I would say that in general, it's basically easier to vote at this time in American history in most places than I think it has been in the past. And so I think access to voting is pretty decent. I mean, again, it sort of varies by state as to sort of the hurdles and for registration and that sort of thing. But certainly in terms of like the ability to cast a ballot early or to vote by mail, it's generally pretty robust, and certainly more robust in the country as a whole than even it was maybe 10, 20 years ago. Partisan gerrymandering, unfortunately, it's always been in part of American life. You can find examples of it even prior to become the United States becoming an actual country. Like you go back to the colonial days and find examples of district lines drawn to benefit one side or the other. Now I will say that it seemed like there were certain states, like Virginia is one, that adopted kind of bipartisan or nonpartisan or less partisan forms of redistricting. The commission system in Virginia after 2020, it didn't really work as intended. The commission didn't produce maps. The Supreme Court of Virginia did through special masters that I think were basically fair. Again, reasonable people can disagree about that. But Virginia voted to adopt a partisan Democratic gerrymander in response to Republican gerrymandering efforts elsewhere. Um, and I do think from the gerrymandering perspective, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. Now, again, that doesn't prevent anyone from voting, but it does in many places, really accelerate, the sort of minority party in a state from being able to elect many, if any, members of the U.S. House, and that'll probably trickle down to state legislatures even more so over time.
And my last question, I think that you've kind of emphasized this many times throughout our interview, but I do just want to ask cut and dry. This is unquestionably a win for Republicans, what we're seeing with the disintegration of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, I think so. Again, at least in the short term. Now, again, the ripple effects are going to be wide here. And again, this could also give Democrats a freer hand in some of their states to effectively spread out Democratic votes more. Now, on the Democratic side, you're going to have the situation where, certainly there are going to be fewer Black Democratic House members from the South in the longer term. And if you're in like a place like Chicago, for instance, and Illinois is a state the Democrats control that already has Democratic gerrymander, and maybe Illinois Democrats will want to squeeze even more seats out of that state by effectively spreading out, diluting some of the majority minority districts in those states. But will Black Democrats in Chicago want to go along with that, particularly when they're seeing, potentially Black representation in other places, being reduced for partisan reasons? That's an open question, but I think we're just in we were in one era of how redistricting worked before Calais. Now we're in a new era of how redistricting works, and again, the ripple effects are gonna be with us for a long time.
Okay. We really appreciate you joining us. That's Kyle Kondik. He is the managing editor of Sabado's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia Center for Politics, and we appreciate the insight. It's something that I think has left many people confused, and so it's helpful to have you on to kind of parse through this all and lend some context to it. So thanks, Kyle, so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so our second interview today, this Friday has been moving again. That's Kyle Kondik, the managing editor of Sabado's Crystal Ball. Larry Sabado over at the University of Virginia has also done great work to help us understand everything happening with our voting system. And again, a landmark piece of civil rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson more than 60 years ago with the original stated goal to challenge racially discriminatory election practices, has now has seriously sort of come under scrutiny and question after this 6-3 ruling by the Supreme Court in a Louisiana redistricting case. So Section 2 of that Pillar Voting Rights Act is now has lost some of its power, if you will. So a very, very influential ruling by the Supreme Court here, and it remains to be seen how this will bear out when it comes to elections. But as you heard from Kyle there, a lot of different things that will, a large sort of chain of events to come from this, and how that will shake out in terms of representation in the House of Representatives and in Congress and in the Senate, we will see.